On August 4th, 1878, Ernest Lundeen was born to Carl Hendrik Lundeen and Christine Charlotte Lundeen, being the oldest of 7 children, 3 of which would die from a diphtheria outbreak in 1887. The Lundeen family was prominent in the area, Carl being the one who named the township that they resided in, as well as establishing a school there. The Lundeens would not live there long, as they would move to Harcourt, Iowa, where he would enroll in Dayton High School, graduating in 1895, and 1 year afterwards, he would move to Minnesota. During that time, he would end up serving in the 12th Regiment of the Minnesota Volunteers in the Spanish-American War, then entering the National Guard after the war ended. He would also enroll and graduate from Carleton College in 1901. Ernest would then enroll in University of Minnesota Law School, entering the bar in 1906. As is common for lawyers to do at the time, Ernest would soon enter in the realm of politics, running for the 42nd District of the Minnesota House of Representatives in 1910 as a Republican. In 1914, he decided to forego re-election and instead run for the Republican nomination in the 5th Congressional District, which he lost to incumbent George Ross Smith. However, when he challenged him a second time the following election, he would end up winning the primary and the seat rather easily. And rather than taking the job easy and coasting on it for a long while, Ernest made enemies really fast, as 1 month into his term was the vote to enter World War I, Ernest being one of 50 who voted nay. And boy, his constituents did not like that, as not only did he lose the primary, but mere months after losing his seat, Ernest was slated to give a speech about the war, and people were so mad at him that he was literally chased into a refrigerated rail car, locked into it, and taken down the tracks for 20 miles. Despite this, Ernest remained undeterred, running for his seat again in 1920, and seeking both Senate seats in 1922 and 1923. While doing this, Ernest came to 2 realizations. One, he needed something to take his mind off of politics, so he would end up getting married to a woman named Norma Ward and would have 2 kids with her. And also, he realized that his future within the Republican Party was 100% kaput, and he needed to find a new way to become politically viable, which meant that he could not run as a Democrat. Thankfully, at that time period, a newer force was rising in Minnesota that basically would become the second party in a 3-party state. The Farmer Labor Party, a loose coalition of basically anybody who was deterred from the Republicans and Democrats, primarily populists and progressives, mostly people who were non-interventionists to isolationists in their foreign policy. Ernest joining up with them to run for Congress in 1926. When that was a failure, he would become their nominee in 1928. When that didn't work, he sought his old seat in a special election after the incumbent joined the Hoover administration. When that didn't work, he would run for the Senate in 1930, which also failed. Now you would think that running and losing multiple times would be a detriment, but not for Ernest, because he had begun to build a base about himself within the Farmer Labor Party, obviously helped by the fact that his name kept popping up on the ballot in Minnesota. And in 1930, Minnesota had decided to forego the congressional district system and instead decided to have an at-large race where each party would select 9 nominees, and then in the general election, the top 9 vote-getters, regardless of party affiliation, would be representatives of the state. And this was a prime time for Ernest to run again, and in the MFL primary, Ernest Lundeen got 2nd place, and in the general election, he got 4th place, thus putting him back in the halls of Congress, where he would again paint himself as a bit of a maverick, leading the charge for Congress to pass the Workers' Unemployment Insurance Bill, a bill that was formulated by the American Communist Party, even bringing their leaders like Earl Browder to Congress to testify in support of it. However, Ernest wasn't able to save it from dying in committee. Speaking of dying, the upcoming 1936 Senate race in Minnesota was sadly rife with that, which led to a lot of convoluted twists and turns. In fact, this race is so convoluted and full of twists and turns, I could make a whole video on this race alone. But you'll see why I have to talk a little bit about it here. The incumbent Senator Thomas D. Schall was on his way to run for re-election when he was hit by a car and died. Due to this, not only did the currently scheduled election go on as planned, but also the incumbent Farmer Labor Party governor, Floyd B. Olson, had to not only appoint a successor to serve until November, but also have a special election for a person to serve until the beginning of the next session of the Senate, which would again happen simultaneously with the Senate election for the full term, which put the farmer labor rights in a weird bind on what to do next. And that's when everybody just started making deals left and right. The first deal to be made was a deal between Floyd Olson and Franklin Roosevelt, where in exchange for the farmer labor rights to ignore Charles Coughlin's Union Party, Roosevelt would not only tell the Minnesota Democrats to not run any candidates in the upcoming Minnesota elections, but also would give any senator or representative elected by the Farmer Labor Party patronage in his administration. This deal making Floyd Olson decide to forego running for re-election for governor and instead run for the Senate seat, while Benson would forego running in the Senate seat to run for governor. And due to the fact that Olson was a massively popular politician, not only in Minnesota, but especially in the Farmer Labor Party, Olson overwhelmingly won the nomination for Senate, and was very much slated to be the next senator from Minnesota. And that's when Olson passed away from stomach cancer, which meant that the Farmer Labor Party no longer had a nominee. And that's where Ernest Lundeen stepped in and offered himself as the nominee for Senate. And due to all the name recognition that he had been building up to this point, the party trusted him and made him the nominee. As such, Ernest Lundeen, without putting any work, managed to become the next senator from Minnesota. Lundeen was grateful for all that had happened, even thanking his tovarshichi in the Friends of the Soviet Union for helping him get this far. Much like his house runs, he sought to make himself a maverick once more, but maybe not in the way he wanted. When Lundeen first entered the office in 1937, there were rumblings of the United States getting involved in another world war. Lundeen, much like before, was a fierce opponent of the idea of the US getting involved in a foreign conflict. This was nothing new, as a lot of people were opposed to the US entering World War II at first, regardless of which side of the aisle they fell under. Why? Multitude of reasons, being a pacifist by nature, having sympathy towards fascism, but most of the vocal opposition, primarily coming from senators from the Midwest, stemmed from concerns regarding the legitimacy of World War I, especially with the recently completed Nye Committee, which showed the war had a huge profit incentive, which led to that sentiment to get more vocal as the years went on. And while that meant that Lundeen always had an electoral base, it wasn't really a moneymaker, as you cut off the same people who pay for the wars to continue, who would never donate to an isolationist, which was a bit of a problem for Lundeen, as he was a bit of a stickler for cash, to the point where he would even request his staffers for a kickback on their salary. All of this would end up putting Lundeen in the crosshairs of another group of people, a group that was better equipped for a more devious plan. Meet George Sylvester Viereck, a German-American poet that was also known for his outspoken stances during the First World War, mostly defending his homeland and advocating the US to leave Germany alone, which managed to put him in the same circles as other non-interventionists, including Lundeen, which he continued to do so as he used his writing to publish interviews with many prominent individuals. And when Lundeen was elected to Senate, Viereck was interested in helping him out, basically asking Lundeen for a job. He would use his writing skills to write Lundeen's speeches. Lundeen would then use his oratory skills to make the speeches pop. and they would work together to combat the so-called merchants of death. Viereck even went so far as to say that he would pay Lundeen for this. Lundeen wouldn't have to pay him at all. And this ended up being a great deal for Ernest, so he accepted without looking into it any further. And thus, Viereck was a prominent member of Lundeen's staff. While Lundeen made speeches on the Senate floor denouncing the British for pushing us into their war, Viereck was handling everything behind the scenes, writing said speeches, organizing appearances, using the phone, sending mail, etc. These two seem to be a well-oiled machine, which could possibly make Ernest into a very successful politician. However, there was one major snag. Remember earlier when I said that Viereck's position in regards to World War I was mostly due to loyalty to Germany? Yeah, well, that was still his primary reason for opposing the US involvement in this war. Of the many interviews that Viereck did in between the wars, one of which was with an up-and-coming Adolf Hitler, whom he had great sympathy for, even making a speech in 1934 to a pro-Nazi group known as the Friends of New Germany, comparing Roosevelt to Hitler and asking the audience to openly sympathize with Nazism without being anti-Semitic, which is already troubling in and of itself. But what's worse is, Viereck's connections to Hitler didn't cease. He was still an ally to Hitler while working for Lundeen. In case you need it spelled out, none of this was a coincidence. Viereck was working on behalf of the Nazi government to infiltrate the Senate and disseminate Nazi propaganda to the US populace, because the Senate gets special mailing privileges, being allowed to send anything in the mail on taxpayers' expense, which Viereck would use to send the speeches that he wrote to thousands of people across the United States. Remember those calls that I mentioned earlier? Those were Viereck corresponding with a Nazi diplomat named Hans Thomsen in order to further coordinate the plan, supplying both aid with the speeches and money to make it possible. Money that would also end up in Lundeen's pocket, who at best seemed to not understand what was going on at all, even having Viereck correspond with congressional allies of his like Hamilton Fish, and ignoring when Viereck kept getting asked to come testify in the Dies Committee due to his association with German officials. And as the years went on, Lundeen's speeches got a bit more, let's just say, enthusiastic, making a plea on the Senate floor that the US take British colonies like Bermuda as repayment for World War I, stating, "I have never heard a German or a German-born American with the gall to ask that we help Germany, but red, yellow, brown, and black and white races are all expected to die for the British Empire. I warn the American people that we cannot defend America by defending old, decadent, and dying empires." And things got so blatant to the point of Lundeen giving a speech underneath a Nazi flag while meeting with the Board of Trade for German-American Commerce in March of 1940, stating, "It is our duty to cultivate friendship and trade with all nations. It is our duty to cultivate friendly and cordial relationships with the great German Reich and its people." Even his old comrades got wind of Lundeen's shift, officially severing any ties they had with him, denouncing him as a reactionary. Another group that was suspicious of Lundeen's political shift was the FBI, who had begun investigating Viereck's connections to Nazi officials, and what that meant for his connections to members of Congress. Which was bad for Lundeen, because not only was he the first, but he was also the most connected to Viereck. Viereck was working almost exclusively in Lundeen's office, and was so connected to Ernest that he was basically Lundeen's second spouse. So Ernest knew he was screwed, which became even more apparent to him on August 31st, 1940, when he was slated to give another speech in preparation of Labor Day. And if you thought that his March speech was crossing a line, wait until you see this section of the speech. there is so little foundation for the hysterical cry that Hitler is attacking the world that it would not be worth mentioning were it not for the invidious intrigue behind it. To this day, Germany has, to my knowledge, taken no step which was not directed at, or incidental to, the restoration of a pre-1914 Germany and Austria. By the time Lundeen was slated to make this speech, the Nazis were occupying France and Norway. I think this is when it hit him that he was no longer just doing non-interventionism, because the day he got that speech, he broke down in tears in his office. A secretary who was supposed to take him to the airport asking him what was wrong, with Ernest simply responding with, "I've gone too far to turn back," before embarking on his trip to a destination that never saw him. Pennsylvania Central Airlines Flight 19, Lundeen's flight, would end up crashing into an alfalfa field in Lovettsville, Virginia. All 21 of its passengers would die that day, of course including Lundeen, which was seen as a huge blow to the non-interventionist sentiment in the US Senate. Minnesota's other senator, Henrik Shipstad, being quoted as saying, "In his stand against conscription and the New Deal foreign policy, he showed himself a very courageous man." I think I should mention this. Henrik Shipstad was also a fascist. He believed that the Protocols of Elders of Zion was fact. And while many would mourn the loss without thinking about it, there were others that thought something was a little off. While Lundeen's investigation wasn't public knowledge as of yet, 3 of the passengers on the plane were criminal investigators, so there was some suspicion of foul play that would be looked at by the Bureau of Air Commerce, a government organization ironically championed by Lundeen. And as they looked, the US government started letting it be known about some of the things that they were looking into in regards to Ernest and the crash. One element, of course, being their prior investigation into him and Viereck. And journalists were astonished and began publishing stories about what they were hearing. But one person was not happy about any of this information coming out. Norma. A mere 2 days after the crash, Norma had gone to her husband's office and had started clearing out everything regarding her husband's correspondence with Viereck, and she was very hostile to any journalist who wanted to cover the story, threatening to sue one for defaming her husband's name and going on NBC radio to denounce another journalist, stating, "These vilifiers of my husband's memory waited until his voice had been silenced." 1942 was the year she really had to be defensive of her husband, because that was when Viereck was slated to go on trial for failing to register as a foreign agent, and Norma was called as a witness, where she said some things that are very interesting, claiming that Viereck wasn't anti-American, made the plea to people to not drag her husband's name in this trial, and, arguably the most damning of all, being asked by investigators to produce the documents that she took, which she stated were stolen in a burglary. Which is very odd, considering many years after her death, the documents were mysteriously found in the Lundeen family archives. It sure was nice of the burglars to return them after the trial happened, because clearly there was nothing else that could have happened. All of which proved little to sway the case. Viereck was sentenced to 2 to 6 years in prison, of which he served 3, or the public's opinion on Ernest Lundeen, time referring to Norma as the 46-year-old widow of British-hating, German-loving Senator Ernest Lundeen. But there was one last group she wanted to make sure didn't hate Ernest. The Farmer Labor Party, who were put in a similar situation that brought Ernest to the Senate, scrambling for a candidate in a vacant seat. And in order to preserve her husband's legacy, she decided to throw her hat in the ring against 2 prominent farmer laborite politicians, trying her best to paint a stark contrast between her and former Governor Elmer Benson, by claiming he was an internationalist, while using her husband's record as proof that she was a true isolationist. Big problem was, nobody liked her husband's record, and running as a continuance of an unpopular politician is a stupid idea, especially since she was listed on the ballot as Miss Ernest Lundeen, so she lost by a decent margin, and her efforts to paint Elmer Benson as a complete antithesis of Lundeen didn't sway Minnesotans, who were very turned off of the Farmer Labor Party. Afterwards, she would end up getting married to another fascist, isolationist, before dying in obscurity in 1983. And that concludes the fascinating story of Ernest Lundeen, the only senator that I think we can say for 100% certainty was a Nazi. I mean, yeah, what else do you expect me to say? Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and click the bell to notify when a future video of mine comes out. And if you're interested in more content from me, consider supporting me on Patreon.